Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Francis Foster, comedian and co-host of the fantastic show Trigonometry, which I'm sure many of you listening to today's show have watched yourselves. Without further ado, thank you so much, Francis, for being on the show today.
Hey, Scott. How you doing, mate? You all right?
Very, very good. I'm very excited to speak to you. I'm a fan of Trigonometry, so this is kind of a cool thing for me to get to do. It's very exciting to speak to you, and without belaboring it too much, I'll get into my first question, which is based on the fact that you have this really interesting background. You've been a drama teacher, you're a comedian, and at some point in the last few years, as we all know, you got into kind of the cultural commentary space. You started this kind of talk show, this platform for free speech, Trigonometry. What made you want to sort of make that leap specifically into more of this kind of commentary space based on your background? I'm very curious about what specifically precipitated that in the past few years.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, Scott. I don't really see myself as being a commentator. I see myself first and foremost as always being a comedian. The purpose, the reason why we started doing Trigonometry was because 2016, as you may know, the UK went through Brexit and America obviously had Trump. And the general narrative, which was being spread at the time, was the reason for this was because there's stupid, thick, white, racist people who voted against their own self-interest, voted in these people. They are, and to quote Hillary Clinton, the deplorables, both sets of them. And really, they should be condemned and mocked and despised because they've helped to take our country back 40 years. And if we continue to go along down this path, we are going to end up in the dark ages. That was the narrative. Now, my father voted Brexit. My father is none of those things. He's a working class dude, with blue collar, you would say, in America and Canada. Blue collar guy who then worked his way up, was first of his generation, first person in his family to go to college, and worked his way up. Married a woman of color, my mother, who's Latin American, in the 1970s in the UK, which wasn't, the cool or dumb thing to do. So he voted Brexit. So I already knew that narrative, it wasn't real. It was fake. There was something else going on. There was something else that was happening. So my co-host Konstantin and I, Konstantin is a comedian as well, we decided to start a podcast in order to find out what was really going on with the world. What is actually really happening? What are the conversations that we should be having? Because the mainstream media, became very apparent to me, wasn't telling me the truth. So there has to be something else. Something else is happening out there. And it started almost as well, not almost, but it started as a path of self-discovery, in that, we started looking at Brexit and we started uncovering the reasons why people voted for Brexit. And from there, it spread into numerous things. It spread into the corruption of the mainstream media. We started looking at the issue of trans. We started looking at, civil liberties. We started looking at free speech. And from there, it's drifted off into everything. Now we talk about everything from the drug war to civil liberties, freedom of speech, mental health, and everything else.
Yeah, this is what you're describing is a pattern that I think has played out for so many people around the world, really over the course of the past 5 to 10 years, which is noticing that something is afoot in the kind of cultural political space all across Western civilization, and having people who maybe didn't think of themselves as commentators or even necessarily as politically active. In your case, you're an entertainer, a comedian. A lot of other people have kind of been coming out and wanting to do something and delve into these things, because the sort of credentialed commentariat that we relied on, and you alluded to this in referring to the corruption of the mainstream media, that commentariat has, I don't know if collapsed is the right word, but something has happened with them where they're not making sense of things anymore so much as they're just kind of driving home an agenda. How much does that have to do with kind of what you're doing at Trigonometry? Do you see you and Konstantin and what you're doing as sort of an alternative to what we've got going on in a lot of the sort of legacy media spaces?
Well, look, let's be honest, neither Konstantin or I are trained journalists. Konstantin, before he started this, was an interpreter. I was a teacher. I was, as you alluded to, a drama teacher, but also taught primary for 6 years after that. So neither of us, like I said, is trained journalists. But what we were interested lay people who had a passion for politics, had an interest in it, and could see something happening, but also were aware enough to realize that what we were being told wasn't the truth. So I think a lot of people are slowly awakening to the fact that the mainstream media aren't telling you, they're not being completely honest or totally honest, or in fact, even honest. As a result of that, what is happening is that you feel that you're being lied to, you're becoming ever more mistrustful, and you're looking for ways to find new news, to actually delve into subjects, to actually understand subjects in a greater detail. And that's what happened with trigonometry. That's what we started to do. And the brutal truth is, it says something about society. It says something about the mainstream media when two idiot comedians make a show that has become so popular, and people going, "Oh, I prefer this to the New York Times." I mean, that's fucking tragic.
Yeah.
Let's be fair.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something I've definitely felt with a lot of what's emerged over the past few years. I mean, even with myself, I've been like, why do just random people like me and comedians and other have to like jump into this space where we have, you mentioned trained journalists, we have people whose life's work is supposed to be giving us the information we need to make sense of the world, to build a better society. Something really, really happened over the course of the past like 5 to 10 years. And this is where I think I've noticed a lot of people like you emerging, myself kind of emerging in the space to a lesser extent. I want to ask you though, you talk about, trained journalists and sort of what they've been up to. With your background as a comedian, as a teacher, how do you feel maybe that those things have served your capacity as a host on Trigonometry while you're sort of speaking about what's going on in the world? Because I think that it's actually been a good thing that the sort of trained journalist mindset, it works really well for certain kind of investigative stories if you really are an ethical journalist, but it also can blind you to certain sort of heterodox ideas. It makes you feel uncomfortable doing certain things. How do you think that being a comedian, being a teacher has maybe served you as you've sort of have gone in this direction in the past few years?
Well, I think it served me in a number of ways. Look, I think the most important thing is actually not that I'm a comedian, not that I'm a teacher. I think the most important thing is that I don't work in an institution. I don't have to toe the lines. I don't have to follow company policies. We have a newspaper which I'm sure that your readers are probably, viewers, I should say, are very much aware of, which is The Guardian. There is still, in the UK, there is still phenomenal journalists that work at The Guardian. People like Simon Jenkins, for instance. Nesri Malik is another person who works at The Guardian, incredible journalist. The problem is that once you are in an institution like The Guardian, you could be this Glenn Greenwald-esque figure. But the reality is, if you were going to write, if you were going to create content, reporting that is actually true, fair, and honest, your time will be limited at that particular institution and you will be forced out. And, we saw that with Suzanne Moore, what happened to her at The Guardian, who's a UK journalist who was gender critical, took the wrong side on the trans debate and was forced out of her job as a result. So the problem is the moment you work for an institution, you become beholden to that institution and you become beholden to that institution's politics. It's just how it is, unfortunately. So yeah, the most important thing is that we're truly independent. We're funded by the people who watch us, by our subscribers. And as a result of that, we're truly free to produce the content that we believe in.
Well, and that's been the beauty of, I think, the internet and kind of the new media space, is that people don't need to go through these institutions in order to do this. I was somebody who was very, very connected within the Democratic Party in my home state, and I got the hell out of there. I mean, I could see what was going on there circa 2017, shortly after Trump was elected. And yeah, I've never looked back. And I know that my life and my ability to do what I'm doing right now has been so much better because I got the hell out of an institution like that. And I know many people who are former journalists, who are former political operatives, who feel the same way. So I think that's a great point. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of when you're a part of these institutions, they have been kind of infected. And there's this thing where you can't even stick like the littlest toe out of line. In the US, one of the best examples is Barry Weiss, who you might be familiar with. She worked at the New York. Right, exactly. And she is not she's, I mean, not that it would be a problem if she was right wing, but she's not even right wing, let alone an extremist. She's a feminist leftist woman working at the New York Times. She happens to be supportive of Israel and be supportive of freedom of speech, of all things. What an awful thing. And she was bullied basically out of the New York Times. I mean, she was constantly being intimidated by her coworkers in ways that were just beyond unacceptable. And that's all publicly available for anyone who wants to look into it. There's almost sort of like this, people talk about cancel culture and they don't realize how deep it goes. And this is something I wanted to ask you about. I know that you're not currently working within an institution, and that's been a big boon to you as someone in this space. But I know from listening to another interview that you did have a situation a few years ago where you had hosted a comedy event called Comedy Unleashed. And there was sort of this hit piece that came out, right, from Vice. You're sort of trying to brand it as like, oh, this was alt-right comedy night and, Nazi Hitler, Francis Foster, which of course everyone knows is completely untrue. But as I understand it, your head teacher at the time did become aware of the article, but because he was a level-headed, reasonable guy, you ended up being able to keep your job. As someone who was targeted by kind of a mob, or at least this sort of coordinated smear campaign, which is what these things are, I don't want to ask you so much about the impact it had on you, not because I don't care about that, but because that gets talked about pretty much every time cancel culture comes up. You can't really say enough about it, but it comes up constantly, just sort of like what it's like to go through it. I'm really curious, though, what you think maybe some of the solutions are, which is what I like to do on this show, is try to stick to the solutions, hopefully. What do you think our society can do, whether it's in the UK, in the US, all across Western civilization, to combat these sort of cancel mobs, these smear campaigns? How do you think we de-incentivize these behaviors? How do you think we reverse this terrible trend of people being fired for their beliefs and for telling the truth?
I think it's by standing up. It's by saying that you disagree. It's by voicing your opinions, no matter how terrifying it may be. And let's be honest, it is terrifying. I think that's the only way to do it, is to stand up and say, I disagree with this. There was an incident of a comedian in the UK, and he came out and he said, he wrote a piece in a right-leaning newspaper, a right-wing newspaper, just to make that clear. Not that really that should have any bearing on this particular story. He wrote an article about how he applied to do a gig and they turned him down because he was a straight white man. And they said it. And he quoted what the promoter said. And there were text messages and so on and so forth. And he wrote a piece about it. And his piece basically said, it shouldn't matter what you are, black, trans, white, gay, doesn't matter. Booking for a gig or any type of industry should be based on meritocracy. That was his argument. Now, you and I don't think that's particularly controversial.
Certainly shouldn't be.
No, but the bile that was rained down on him, and people were quote tweeting him, and there was a pile-on happening here, and saying, that he was right-wing. This is another example of white fragility, white male fragility. And then a very well-known and powerful agent came out and lambasted him and condemned him. And he says that he lost gigs as a result, and I can believe he did as well. The only way you're going to stop people by doing this is for people to come out and say that you disagree with what happened by standing up. That's really the only way to do it. And look, I was talking actually with one of my producers about this very fact today, and we had a back and forth about it. And I do understand. And look, there's the other part of it where, I understand why people don't get involved. If you've got kids, if you've got a mortgage, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, which the vast majority of people in our society are, the vast majority of Americans are. But I think that if you can, you should stand up. You should stand up because, number one, you become a better person as a result of that. You have integrity, you have bravery, and that ultimately makes you more attractive as a person. Not just, attractive in the truest sense, in that people will want to be with you and people want to be around you because they realize that you have integrity and you stand up for your beliefs. But also as well, it makes for a better person, and also it makes you better at your job, whatever your job is, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a comedian, whether you're, you're an accountant, because you become braver as a result. So I would urge everybody who sees this to stand up and say that they disagree. That's the most important thing, because if we all did this and went, no, we disagree with that. We disagree with Barry Weiss being hounded out of the New York Times. We disagree with Suzanne Moore being kicked out of The Guardian. And also as well, standing up for people that you disagree with, which not enough people do, both left and right. I see a lot of people on the right go, look at them, blah, 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 look, they've been cancelled, And you go, well, you're not helping. You're not helping, because then what we've descended to is petty point scoring, and that helps no one.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Francis, is one of the most important things that someone can say, which is just do it. We're in this catch-22 situation where I feel like there are many people who want to make zero sacrifice in what is mounting to a sort of battle for Western civilization. Things are getting bad out there. It's like the Joker movie. Things are getting crazy out there. And I think that what you're alluding to in a way is something that I've been trying to tell people a lot lately, as someone who has sacrificed professionally many things, in order to be able to speak up like this. Someone I've sacrificed many personal relationships. I'm sure, unfortunately, that you've had to too. Pretty much everyone who does this has to. That people feel like they're in this catch-22 where it's like, I want to speak up, but then something bad might happen. And it's like, depending on what that bad thing is, you do have to take it on the chin. I mean, you have to make a sacrifice is something that I would emphasize. I know that a lot of people don't want to lose their job. That's kind of where I draw the line. Is I try to be Scott Veritas is not my real name, as you might have guessed. It'd be a very cool last name, but it's not. I do have a little bit of sensitivity around my job, but in terms of the personal relationships, I always tell people in the long run, you're going to be better off because like you said, you're going to attract better people into your life when you're telling the truth. It's 100%. Going to work out for you in the long run. And you're going to probably shed a few people that weren't particularly good friends of you to begin with.
Yeah. But that process of where you shed friends and you go through that process is incredibly painful. And it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge that fact. It is incredibly painful when you have friends who turn around and accuse you of being a nasty person. I had someone who was a friend of mine who accused me of being a provocateur and all of these, different things, mean and nasty. And when it's somebody who you're actually close to, it's very painful. It's very, 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 very painful. But the reality is the only way to live your life is with integrity. And that comes attached with a caveat in that with some people, if you've got kids, if you've got to pick and choose your battles. But the more that we can all stand up, the better it will be for everyone.
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, people do have to make those sacrifices. But as you said, it's remarkably painful. There's a term I learned from somebody named Taya Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's
I know Taya. Yeah.
Very, very cool creator. She talked about identity quake, the whole idea of the identity quake, because you don't just lose friends in this process. You'll kind of lose a part of yourself, but that process is rewarding in the end. I remember around 2017, just the sense of losing my sense of self as I kind of shed my Democratic Party credentials and slowly but surely kind of moved away from my life as a political operative. And it felt like I was becoming a completely different person, and I didn't know how that would end. And in the end, it made me a better person. It made me feel like I was surrounded by better people. It cleared up so many things in my head when I started focusing on what's true. And at the end of the day, I think if people can make that their guiding light, they'll be in a good place. That the truth kind of comes before everything else. And it's also generally, if you follow it, it'll put you in a better place than if you kind of stick to the comforting lies.
Yeah. 100%. It will make you a better person. It will make you better at your job. You will become freer as a result. You'll become happier as a result. You'll become more attractive as a result. All of these things are true. It doesn't stop the process of when you're going through it being really, really fucking painful.
Yeah. And shocking and disorienting and confusing as well, for sure. But, speaking of uncomfortable truths, I want to ask you, since you're a comedian, I want to ask you about comedy. I would not have a comedian on the show without asking him about comedy, because the state of comedy is in sort of a weird place. Comedy, as I'm sure you well know, being a comedian, it is very much this place where a lot of the greatest comics have spoken truth to power or spoken these uncomfortable truths. One of the best things a comedian can do is say something out loud that makes the whole room laugh. But they're laughing at something that they've been thinking in their head, but they've never said out loud before. And maybe it's because they're afraid to say it out loud, but they all think it in their head and they're thinking as they're laughing. I've thought that so many times. That's so funny to hear this professional entertainer say it the way that he just said it. That has been what comedy has been for decades. And the best comedians like Carlin and many others have always done this sort of thing. I wanted to ask you to what extent you feel like comedy is still the space to do that, because there's been this sort of wokeification of the entertainment sector worldwide. There's the clapter phenomenon where people seem a lot more interested in clapping than laughing in certain situations. How do you feel about the state of comedy? Do you think it's still a space for heterodox ideas and voices to emerge and sort of challenge preconceived notions? Or do you think that it's a tighter space, or maybe not the best space to be doing that anymore?
I, look, this question is actually, the answer is very, very difficult to answer, and I'll tell you why. Because when we're talking about comedy, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about comedy online? Are we talking about, TV shows, films, etc., etc.? But let's address stand-up first of all, and let's address. I can't really speak about stand-up in the US. I've never gigged in the US, but I'll tell you a little bit about how comedy works in the UK. In the UK, we have the Edinburgh Festival. So if you want to get noticed as a comedian, you go to the Edinburgh Festival. You do your hour show. And then the judges for the Edinburgh Awards will come and see you. And if they think that you have an outstanding show, and you will either get nominated for a newcomer, if it's your first show, or the main award, right? And it's a huge accolade. And that's where you go as a comedian to make your name, to make waves for yourself, and to get noticed. Now, the person who actually is in charge of that show, in charge of the awards, is a lady called Nika Burns, who also owns the Soho Theatre in London, one of the owners of the Soho Theatre. Now, if you do well at the Edinburgh Festival, your show then transfers to the Soho to do a number of runs. I think it was in 2017 or 2018, Nika Burns said in a speech at the Edinburgh Festival that she was looking forward to the next generation of woke comedians deciding what is and what isn't acceptable. I'm going to say that one more time. The woman in charge, one of them in charge of the Edinburgh Festival Awards, the Comedy Awards, one of the senior tastemakers in this industry, said that she's looking forward to the next generation of woke comedians deciding what is and what isn't acceptable.
God help
so
us.
Already, what you have is a situation where one of the most powerful people in charge says, I only want opinions that I agree with. And once you have that, then the entire thing is screwed. It's screwed. Because if you come in and you want to challenge, the people in charge, which in the arts is the liberal left, the woke left, they're the ones in charge. They're the tastemakers. They're the agents. They're the ones who have the power. But if you want to challenge them, forget it, you ain't going to progress. That is how it works. Now, you can go online. You can build an audience online, as both Konstantin and I have done, and that's been great. So there are other avenues for you. But the reality is, if you want to progress within the mainstream comedy industry, then you better have the right opinions. And if you don't, you're going to struggle. And that's just the reality of it. Now, if you go and do a gig around the country, I would say most people are fine. Most people don't care. Most people don't even know what woke is. Most people just want to go to a comedy show and laugh. That's all they want. They don't want anything else, right? But the industry that controls it, that's something very, very different. And if you are one of those people who generally has heterodox views, who wants to challenge, who wants to say things, say the unsayable, then you're going to have to make it your own way. But the good thing is, it's never been a better time to do that. But you've got to plow your own furrow. And the old way of doing it, it just doesn't exist anymore. And that's why, like, for instance, comedy at the BBC has been going through the floor because the comedy is now woke. They now promote people based on race, sex, gender, whatever else it may be, not on the actual caliber of the performer or the caliber of the writing. And as a result, they've been hemorrhaging audience. And that's where we are now.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying absolutely rings true, that the industry, if you want to go through these sort of traditional means that 20 or even 10 years ago, you would have thought is the only way to make it before the internet had kind of evolved, in these social media platforms where people are building audiences, including TikTok, which is relatively new, evolved. that is definitely, that door seems to be closing, if not closed. I mean, what you said about that woman in the UK, that's just not what comedy is about. I mean, if anything, it is about challenging, preconceived notions and or orthodox. I mean, she said, I'm looking forward to finding out what's acceptable. Comedy is about finding out what's unacceptable in many cases. They're about what's finding out what's on the line. Like comedians can do this great thing where they stick just one little pinky toe kind of on the line or over the line. And that's one of the best things they can do because it makes the audience think about that. This idea of I'm waiting to find out what's acceptable it's astonishing.
It is astonishing. And that is pretty much her quote verbatim. I might have got the year wrong. It might have been 2018 or 20, can't remember, but that doesn't matter. That is the quote. Do you think that the American Christian right found Bill Hicks acceptable?
Yeah.
Do you think like woke liberals will find Patrice O'Neill acceptable?
No. And he's one of the greatest of all time, Patrice.
Yeah, of course he is. We all know that. We all know that. Why is it that your WhatsApp groups where you chat with your mates are funnier than 99% of comedies? And look, there'll be people going, oh, well, look, Ricky Gervais, Bill Burr, blah, blah. Those people have already made it. They've already got huge audiences. You can't cancel Bill. What, Netflix are going to say, look, we're not going to put a show on. He doesn't care. He'll go and sell out wherever he wants. He'll release a special himself. He's fine. Same with Ricky. Same with all these people, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to make it now as a comedian, then you better toe the line. But also there's a flip side. There's a lot of people, and look, I did it as well, like moaning about the industry and going, oh, I'm never going to get a break, and blah, blah, they don't want straight white man. And I'm like, yeah, that's all true. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What, are you going to sit there and moan? Or are you going to plot your own course? And in a way, that's more exciting. It's more exciting to plot your own course. It's more exciting to put you on your own shows. It's more exciting to play with the form, see what you can do. We've got a show called Raw, which goes out 4 nights a week. It's an hour and a half of improvised political comedy and commentary, talking about the world. And we perform for 6 hours a week. I would never have done that if I'd adhered to the traditional model. That would never have come into existence. I'm a much better stand-up comedian, ironically, because of the lockdown, because this is what I've been doing all day, every day. So you just become better as a result. And it's why it's important, and I will say this to any comedians or any performers who are listening. It is the best, it is the worst at times, but it's also the best at times. Because you have got billions of people out there that you can connect with. You have just got to go out there and do it. And realize that no one's going to give it to you. There's going to be no agent at the back of a club chomping on a fat cigar going, hey kid, we're going to make you a star. That probably never existed. And if it did, it's dead. The world's moved on. It's up to you. And in a way, that's the most exciting place you can be.
Yeah, what you're saying, Francis, is not just true. I think it applies in so many other areas. I mean, this isn't just about comedy. This is about almost anything you want to do. Even if you want to teach, you can teach people. I mean, working within educational institutions today, definitely in the US, I'm not sure entirely what's going on in the UK, but in the US, it is fraught with many little pitfalls for you that are related to kind of the woke orthodoxy, especially at the college level. But you can teach on YouTube. And I mean, look at what Jordan Peterson has done. I mean, the guy has been lecturing millions of people, including me and you and all his many, many fans all around the world without teaching at an actual school. He's doing it in these auditoriums where people want to go. And it goes for, if you want to make movies, if you want to make music, if you want to do anything without having to deal with this, like, oh, you got to stay within this very, very narrow, acceptable frame, which just is it is the death of creativity. It is which, teachers have to be creative. Everyone has to be creative. But when you're confined to these boxes, it makes it impossible. We do have the tools now to do it in so many other ways. And I just want to emphasize, I don't think this is just relevant to comedy. I think it's relevant to almost anything you want to do in life. Even if you want to start your own business, the internet presents so many ways to do it in kind of a different way. Anything where you have to market yourself, you don't necessarily have to rely on the old gatekeepers who are sort of hanging on by a thread, because we're also seeing a transfer of audience from, cable news ratings plummeting other people in this, you and Constantine being an example, getting a good number of views. This is something that I think it appears as sort of a blessing and a curse, because the internet sort of gave way to a lot of terrible ideas that are the reason that you and I are in the public eye this way. Like, a lot of these woke ideas were born of the internet, born of Tumblr back in the day, or wherever it might be. But it's a blessing and a curse, because it also provides the ability to put these other ideas, these better ideas out there. Probably the best example is Jordan Peterson. I mean, he was somebody that was on the verge of losing his job, and then he started just putting his information out there, and he's become a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, and that's it. And that is the model that you need to follow, because the reality is, and I can only speak from being a comedian, these old ways of doing things, they've become corrupted. They don't work anymore. You look at it and you realize, particularly in comedy, it's not a meritocracy. It's about the narrative. And it takes a long time to give up on that, because we are at the age where we're trained by our parents. You follow the career path, you start off here, then you go to this job, then you go to that job, then you go here, and then you become marketing director. And the reality is that is breaking down more and more. And those ways of doing things are actually very archaic, and they're very 20th century. And it's being brave enough to let go of that and go, in my case, you know what? I'm not going to do the Edinburgh Festival. I have to accept that I'm not going to do TV. I'm not going to do all these other things that my peers and my colleagues are being offered, and being okay with it and realizing that your path is different. And ultimately, your path will become far richer, because you will have integrity, you will be more creative. And as a result of all of that, you will produce something that has far more worth than another dead in the water BBC podcast that no one gives a shit about, for example.
Yeah, God knows nobody wants to be just another one of the clapter comedians, or another one of the celebrities who seem to always have the right views. They seem to always do these interviews, going on Ellen, going on Oprah, and just sort of saying the right thing. It's very funny how they never seem to step out of line, because it's not a natural way for people to think. It is funny how these things fit so neatly into the boxes, the shows we're watching, the podcasts that are being created by some of these legacy outlets. To me, it strikes me as, I actually like to use the word suspicious, because I always think to myself, if you're one of these people that is so perfectly prim and proper with this orthodoxy, it's just like, it's impossible. And it often comes out that people have said something in the past that didn't match up so much with the orthodoxy. And then, of course, there's this fawning apology for saying something that was well within mainstream opinion 2 minutes ago. It has been bizarre. And I've grown quite, I've become very interested in how people seem to be less interested in kind of AAA celebrity culture, I think, because it's just become so predictable and so insipid.
Yeah, because we're bored of it. We're bored, and we realize it has no worth and it has no value. Anybody can now become a celebrity. I mean, that, Warhol predicted that in the future, 15 minutes. Everyone's going to be famous for 15 minutes. And that's a reality now. And we have a program in my country. I don't know if you've got it in yours. You probably have some like variant of it. And I use variant in its truest form. Love Island, where everybody goes and everybody, and so as a result of that, you just look at what is being fed to you and you realize it's trash. People realize that they're being fed a dud. That's why people are switching off. They're switching off in their droves, because they realize that what they're being given is worthless. It's worthless. Not only is it worthless, it's dishonest and it's fake. You can spot that. You can spot that a mile off. There's nothing wrong with someone. Look, if you're woke, if you're a woke comedian, there are still comedians who are actually woke and can be funny, but you can tell that they believe in it. They believe in that. There's a very good comedian who wrote with Chappelle called Neil Brennan. I saw him do his material. It's very woke.
Neil's great.
Yeah, but he's a brilliant comic. So you go, well, look, I disagree, but that's a great joke. Fair play. But you can tell when people don't believe in it, just because you can tell when you're being lied to. And when you're being lied to again and again and again, and you're being given a misrepresentation of the truth, you don't want to have any more part of it. None of us do, which is why we're switching off.
Yeah.
We're being told that something's a comedy and it's not funny. And you can go, well, all humor is subjective, and to an extent it is. But there is such a thing as a shit comedian.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think that is the problem. That's the problem. And I think that we've all come to a state of a collective awakening as to what's happening. And we don't want any part of it anymore.
Yeah, it's the fact that things become so utterly predictable, and you use the word boring, and you actually said this in another interview I was watching. I think it was the episode of Trigonometry where you and Konstantin interviewed each other. You mentioned how this stuff is really starting to bore you, and I don't blame you for saying that, and I'm glad you did. And I wanted to delve into that a little bit, because boring is such a great word for the stuff that doesn't come up enough, because it is so boring, and it's just gotten more boring with time. It reminds me of there was something great that Douglas Murray said, and it may have even been on Trigonometry. It was in some interview I was watching. I can't remember where it was, but he said he was talking about the terrible opportunity cost that is incurred by people, by some of the most brilliant minds on earth, constantly discussing why men and women are different, why free speech is good and censorship is bad, and having to explain this like they're talking to a bunch of 10-year-olds. And this opportunity cost, I wanted to ask you about it, keeping with this theme of how boring this stuff gets. Because what I specifically wanted to know, I can't recall if you addressed this in what I was watching, but what I really wanted to know was, what do you wish we could talk about as a society? If we were in a society where so much of our intellectual bandwidth, our energy wasn't being taken up by woke nonsense, what are the things that you wish we could address and delve into more?
So much. The opioid crisis in America, what is actually happening with our governments and institutions? How do we solve the problem with the fact that the majority of people no longer have faith in their institutions? They no longer have faith in their politicians. How can we fix the political system? How can we have a political system that is actually fairer and represents people more? How can we narrow the income gap? How can we narrow the gap between rich and poor? All of these things. There are so many things that we need to talk about. We did an interview with a former pediatrician. He was talking about dying. We don't talk about dying. We're all going to die. In the West, we pretend that we're not. And you see it again with our celebrities with their smooth, weird, plastic alien faces. But we're all going to die. Why do we not talk about that? Why do we not talk about dying well? Why do we not talk about any of these things? Why do we not talk about legacies anymore, what we want to achieve? There is so much of our society that needs fixing, that doesn't work. And we end up talking about things that don't matter, that really don't matter. And it makes you worry, because there's a saying in England, which is from football, soccer, which is like, you've taken your eye off the ball. And normally what happens when you take your eye off the ball is you swipe and you miss it. And I think we're at a point now as a society where we've taken our collective eye off the ball and we're doing an air shot. And as a result of that, we're going to be in real problems.
Yeah, you could say it would be ironic that the way we could really incur the consequences of what we're doing are keeping our eye off the ball, are not focusing on the things that matter. It's not so much in terms of what might happen, but what might not happen. Not so much what is going to be done by these infected institutions, but by what they're not doing. That they're not, because our media, because our governments, because our everything, our legal systems are even starting to collapse. Definitely in the United States, for sure. I know because these systems aren't focusing on one thing. I was just adapting us to a 21st century world with the internet. People don't really, our brain chemistry is changing. There seems to have been a conversation that started about social media circa maybe 2010, where people were just starting to say like, oh, maybe this isn't such a great idea. Maybe this is kind of messing with us, messing with our children. And then immediately the woke stuff really started to emerge. And that conversation has been going on and off a little bit about how that's affecting us, but it hasn't really taken the forefront, when I think that is possibly the most important conversation we can have, is just, what the hell happened over the course of the past 20 years? Humanity doesn't look at all like it did in the year 2000s, and much more so that if you compare people in the year 1960 to people in the year 1980, or people in the year 1970 to people in the year 1990, they're different, but they're not that different at the end of the day. The past 20 years have been insane. I mean, the past 10 years have been insane. And that is just one of many things that, as you were saying, our eyes aren't on the ball. That's the ball. We have to talk about these things. And the time we are wasting, and there was a minute there where some people, just because they're so brilliant, I mean, a person like Jordan Peterson could read the phone book, right? So when he talks about what makes men and women different, it is fascinating because he's so, rich and intelligent and full of wisdom. But God, it certainly has gotten to the point where even somebody like me, who was very passionate about that stuff, is like, well, I don't know who's getting convinced at this point. What are we going to do now?
And I don't think we talk enough about social media. I don't think we talk enough about what a cancer it is. And I'm using that in its most honest sense. It is pervasive, it is consuming, it is draining. It's the worst. It is the literal worst. We have been given this illusion that these programs, these pieces of software connect us. They don't connect us. They disconnect and they dehumanize us. They disconnect us literally. People make jokes about it. I'll be honest with you, I find it incredibly sad. When I'm sitting at a restaurant, I look over and I see a young couple and they're in their 20s and they're both on their phones whilst they wait for their dinner to be served. And I think, is there anything more depressing? You're young, you're at the peak of your physical fitness, you're at the peak of your physical beauty, and you're just buried in a phone getting dopamine likes whilst not making eye contact. And then there's on the deeper level where it encourages us in order to be angry at one another, to shout, to fall out, to dehumanize, to see each other as avatars on a screen and not real people. It's toxic. And then you look at what it's doing to young kids. For instance, we don't talk enough about what Instagram is doing to young girls. That is going to spawn a deluge, an absolute deluge of mental health, and it already
has. Oh yeah,
already has, and you're seeing it with body dysmorphia, you're seeing it with trans, you're seeing it with all these different things. I started teaching in 2007, I qualified in 2008. By 2011, 2012, most of the bullying allegations and incidences we were dealing with happened on Facebook. And that was 9 years ago, 10 years ago.
I remember I was in school. So I'm 26. I was in high school around the time that Facebook, I remember that. I remember that very clearly.
Yeah, that's when Facebook took off, what happened is a lot of the incidences that would have just happened in the corridor, or a nasty comment or a little note being passed around, now happens online. And what happens as well is that kids are no longer safe at home, because your home is no longer a haven. You go home and you can be accessed, at home.
Yeah. And the kids can't help themselves. They're being lured into these environments that are shooting off dopamine in their head, and then they're going there to become miserable. I want to ask you though, what do you think we do about this? I always try to focus on this show. This is something that, Jonathan Haidt has, I just want to recommend the book real quick, Coddling of the American Mind, which I'm almost certain you've read. Yeah. That a lot of great stuff about this in there. If you want to learn more about it from an actual psychologist, from Jonathan Haidt, who's a great mind. But I want to ask you, Francis, what I typically like to ask people on the show, which is, what would you have our society do about this? I know this is the hardest kind of question to answer, but it's why I like to ask it, is that these solutions questions are kind of the hardest questions to answer. Do you think that we need to take this sort of, maybe the parenting route, where people need to put limits on how much their kids be more monitoring? Do you think there's actually a legislative answer? How do you think we deal with this as a society? What do you think we should do?
Like, number one, there's a personal responsibility element, and this is the most difficult part of it. If you're a parent, until they're 16 or even older, don't give your kid a smartphone. I mean, when I was a primary school teacher, kids were coming in with iPhones at 10 and 11 years old. Don't do that. Don't give your kid a smartphone. And I remember once, and then we'd be doing sex ed when the kids are 10 and 11. and explain, you know, this is a woman, this is a man, this is how sex happens. And I remember a lot of parents coming in going, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, I don't want your kid to teach me about, you to teach my kid about this. I want them to be a child. I'd be like, sir, has your child got an iPhone? Yes, but so what? You don't think your kid is accessing hardcore pornography? No, because I put locks in place. Or your kid
It's
will have
smart.
Your kid is smarter than you at tech. Just accept that. I don't care if you're a lawyer or a banker. Your kid is smarter than you at tech and will have found a way to get around that. So number one, don't give them a smartphone. Number two, I don't think you should be on social media until you're 18. It's as simple as that. You shouldn't be on social media until you're 18. We need a government that is prepared to go against these big tech companies, these monopolies, and get them to act responsibly. Because what they're doing now is they're hijacking a whole generation of brains. And we don't know the long-term effects we're having on it. I remember when we started out, we interviewed a clinical psychologist called Dr. Linda Papadopoulos. And she actually said that there's now been studies put in place that the memory of millennials and the generation that came after the millennials, their memories are the same as people in their 70s, because they're never able to create a fully formed memory, because it's impossible to do that. I can't remember the time space that she gave, because the moment you pick up your phone, boom, you've disconnected yourself. So the memory is never allowed to be truly formed. So their ability to remember and retain information is the same as somebody in their 60s and 70s. Absolutely heartbreaking. And we've basically indoctrinated our entire generation to be completely and utterly miserable. Because what social media does is it encourages you to compare yourself continually to your peers and the people around you. And if you do that, you're not going to look at the people who you perceive to be doing worse than you, whether they are or not. You're going to look at the people who are going to like, oh, yeah, but they're doing great. And why am I not doing great? I must be. It's a constant state of envy. And what envy produces is anger, frustration, and jealousy. And that's how you live in your life, angry, frustrated, and jealous. And then what happens? You have that anger, and that either goes outward and you start being angry and spiteful and resentful at other people, or you become angry and you take that anger and you turn it in on itself, which is depression. And that's what's happening to an entire generation. And we're not talking about it.
No.
And we just seem to be carrying on blindly.
I think the word that rings through in everything that you're saying and what we're talking about is addiction. I always try to tell people, because people hear like, no, of course we can't put limits on how old people can be. Of course we can't be not giving kids, but we need to just be as free as possible and not possibly, limit anything that children are doing, even though, a big part of civilized society is limiting what having the idea of the minor, of somebody who is to some extent answerable to their parents. And it reminds me of kind of the way that addicts talk, which is people don't want to have these things taken away. And people always say like, why do we have to, because I'm with you, Francis. I think we need to make a concerted effort to put limits on particularly how much children are on social media, particularly children, adults, not as much, but definitely children. And I can speak, like I said, from a personal experience. I got on social media at a young age. I don't think that was a great thing for me or for pretty much anybody. But the thing that strikes me about this, and I always try to explain it this way, is we've got an entire generation of addicts. We've got an entire generation, almost anyone under the age of 30 is addicted. And I'm guilty of this to some extent. I spent like an hour on TikTok yesterday. Like I have a limit now on my computer. Yeah, I have a limit. I have a thing that takes me off Twitter if I'm there for an hour. It just says stop. And I get off. And what I always try to explain to people is, imagine a generation where, 80, 90% of people are alcoholics. You'd want to do something about that. And you might go a little bit further than you might otherwise go. Maybe you would start enforcing, alcohol bans on people under the age of 21. At least that's in the United States. In the UK, is it 18?
Yeah, it's 18.
Yeah, so 18 or 21. You might be a little bit more punitive in a world where alcoholism has gone to 90%, which is about where we are with social media addiction. I can't emphasize enough, and I'm glad to hear from you and others that I've been speaking to, something does need to be done. We can't just take this attitude with all of these problems of like, oh, it'll sort itself out. Oh, we can't put any limits on what children are doing. It's like, no, a civilized society actually has to make trade-offs. It comes back to that idea of sacrifice. We need to do things that maybe sound a little uncomfortable, because of course it sounds weird to say that, like, you'd need to present an ID to get a Facebook account. But that's how good ideas sound a lot of the time before you try them. And what we're doing right now is not working. So I certainly don't see how it could get any worse.
And it's also as well because you use a term like addiction, and in our mind's eye, what we see with addiction is, some poor unfortunate with no shoes on, passed out outside a Walmart, with an empty bottle, no top on, and just completely incoherent. When the reality is, there are various different types of addiction, and I'm surprised, and someone probably has done this study, and it just hasn't been publicized, or maybe it has, and I've just not been aware of it. But there needs to be a study done, if there hasn't been, as to how much the average American, UK, kid between the age of 15 to 25 spends on social media every week. And I'm sure if we did that, we would be horrified.
It is an awful lot. It is astronomical. I think that information is out there, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but it is astonishing. It is, I mean, it's just not natural. I think about the way that our minds worked even the television, the electricity is only a couple of centuries old. I mean, the fact that we now have computers in our pockets, and we haven't even bothered to really think about what that could be doing to us. It's not good. And I think it all comes back to the fact that we are misappropriating our energy so much on things that are on their face ridiculous. The one that really comes to mind is the debate over what is a man and what is a woman. That materialized so quickly that one of the questions I find myself asking myself at least like once a week is, how did that happen so quickly? It seems like if you ask someone in 2014, what is a man, what is a woman? Broad agreement. Then like 2 years later, broad disagreement. It just kind of was like this general consensus melted away in a matter of seconds. And I think it's one of the best examples of how we are having our time wasted on nonsense.
Yes, we are completely having our time wasted on nonsense, on things that we all know to be either true or false. You go into a grade 4 class, you say to the kids, what's the difference between a boy and a girl? They'll tell you. They'll tell you. And yet you get to college level in Harvard and people are like, oh, what is it? And you just think that is a sign of a corruption in our society. Because it's not about the question. I mean, you can go, all right, let's look at it from a philosophical point of view. And I suppose there's, there might be merit in that. But when we are not prepared as a society to confront truths and discuss them in a frank and open and honest fashion, you've got a problem. Because think about your own lives, your own life. When you've had a real serious problem, when you're going down a bad path, what did you need? You needed a frank, open, and honest discussion and someone to sit down with you and go, look, you ain't going down a good path here, mate. You need to have a look at this. And the fact that we're not doing this on a wider level, on a societal level, I'll be honest with you, I find terrifying. I find it terrifying. And then the fact that, people who do say these uncomfortable truths, then we try and shut them down, cancel them, smear them. It's a worrying place to be for society, and it's not good. It's not good.
Yeah, I think this is a great metaphor, this talk, this intervention, because in a way it's what people like you and Konstantin are trying to do. I mean, you were comedians and now you're trying to have actually these, in some cases, you guys are still very funny, by the way, but in some cases you have these very serious discussions, which, you're trying to speak to society. I'm trying to do it myself. He seems to come up a lot, but how could he not? Because he's just such a brilliant guy. Jordan Peterson is, again, a great example because he was somebody who, and all the better that he's a clinical psychologist, right? That he's a therapist. He tried to have a talk with society, basically. He tried to say, look, this is the path we're on. I'm somebody who studied this stuff for 50 freaking years. And he was so great about it. I mean, God, because like you said, immediately for doing one of the best things a person can do for their society, which is tell them the goddamn truth. He was attacked like no one I've ever seen in my 26 years of life. I have never seen somebody be so misrepresented for doing a great thing. And what a shock that was. And it happens to everyone. I think that at the end of the day, I always say this. One of the biggest problems we're facing is we are incentivizing to people to do the wrong thing, to lie, to cower. And we de-incentivize. These people de-incentivize as much as they can telling the truth, being a good person, being consistent, having integrity. They actually try to punish you for that. It is so perverse and so backwards. And I think if we can just switch it back, because at the end of the day, human beings are very much creatures of incentive. If we can just switch it back to the way that I feel like it was until not that freaking long ago, and get people to get rewarded for doing the right thing, be punished for doing the wrong thing, we could set ourselves on a good path.
Yeah. And look, and here's hoping. And here's hoping that, you know, that people like yourselves and other people, that we can actually, we have limited power. Unfortunately, that's just the brutal truth of the situation. But if everybody does something, then we can all achieve something remarkable. That's the hope anyway. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what you're trying to do. That's what Jordan Peterson is trying to do. All these people in their own way, whether it's Joe Rogan, whether it's yourself, whether it's me, we're all trying to do that. Whether it's the people, you know, who are risking their jobs and their careers, people who are not famous, people who are standing up, teachers, accountants, whoever it may be. But we need to do that more, because if we don't, I do worry where we're going to end up. I do worry. Because we can't keep going down this path. We just can't. You know, and we've got a lot to lose if we don't sort it out. Because we're very lucky to live in the society that we do. My mum's Venezuelan. I know what it's like when a society does not go well. You don't want to live there. That's not somewhere you want to be. Trust me. And it's up to you what you want to be. Whether you want to be remembered as someone who has integrity, who stood up for what they believed in, stood up for what they valued, who said what they thought was true, or you want to be someone who, you know, doesn't want to get involved in the fight, is worried about it, and doesn't want to get cancelled. And ultimately, by doing that, you're going to let bullies win. And I think it's really that simple. Unfortunately, I think it is. I think the vast majority of people aren't like this. It's a very small, tiny minority of censorious, angry people who want to shut down conversations and actually want to stop us being honest.
I couldn't say it better myself, Francis. And I think that's a great message to leave it on. I know we had an hour, and I know your time is very valuable. I don't want to take up any more than I have to. But this was fantastic, Francis. Real quick before we go, I'm recommending to everyone that you check out Trigonometry and you check out Francis on Twitter and wherever you can find him. Do you want to let people know where they can find you? Is there anything you want to promote before we sign off?
Yeah, so just find me at Francis J. Foster if you're based in London. We're doing shows at the Leicester Square Theatre. We're doing with Andrew Doyle, who is an author of Titania McGrath. And I'm doing a show at the Museum of Comedy on September 12th.
All right. Thanks again, Francis. And if you are listening to today's show, this is the Veritas podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, please leave a 5-star review. If you're listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again to Francis. Thanks again to everybody listening today. This is the Veritas podcast. I will see you all next time.